Hey everybody, this is a piece by Werner Bonefeld titled Abstract Labor, Against Its Nature and on Its Time. This paper is from 2010, and it's from Capital and Class. I'll read a little abstract here. Recent debates on abstract labor have highlighted Marx's ambivalent conception of this important term. This article criticizes current physiological definitions of the term and, against the background of earlier debates in Capital and Class, develops abstract labor as a specifically capitalist form of labor, which entails a specific conception of social labor time, a time made abstract. The political implications of these rival accounts are formidable. All right, now to the actual essay. Numerous critical studies on abstract labor have appeared in recent years. Apart from 3 articles in Capital and Class by De Angelis in 1995, Arthur in 2001, Kisilov and Starosta in 2007, notable contributions have come from Heinrich, 1999, Kay, 1999, Kisilov and Starosta in 2007, Murray in 2000, Postone 1996, and Starosta 2008. Might be Starosta. It's probably actually how it's said. In place of trans-historical conceptions of abstract labor as the physiological expenditure of human energy, or as homogeneous labor that is generally adaptable to the changing demands of capitalist production, the emerging consensus in the contemporary debate conceives of abstract labor as a socially determined, specifically capitalist form of labor that, quote, depends on exchange, end quote. Bellafiore, 2009. This insight was fundamental to earlier debates on value and abstract labor in Capital and Class. See Himmelweit and Mohan, 1978, Eldred and Hanlon, 1981, and De Vrooy, 1982. Their conceptualization of abstract labor as a specific capitalist form of labor goes back to Isaac Rubin's work on value, which was rediscovered in the early 1970s. Rubin had argued, quote, one of 2 things is possible. If abstract labor is an expenditure of human energy in physiological form, then value has a reified material character, or value is a social phenomenon, and then abstract labor must also be understood as a social phenomenon, connected with a determined social form of production. It is not possible to reconcile a physiological concept of abstract labor with the historical character of the value which abstract labor creates. End quote. Rubin. For Eldred and Hanlon, the, quote, determination of abstract labor as a physiological expenditure of labor power leads to the crudest understanding of value and the loss of the socially specific character of value-creating labor. The abstractness of value-creating labor is determined by the exchange process, which accomplishes the abstraction from the multifarious concrete labors objectified in commodities. End quote. Eldred and Hanlon. Similarly, De Vrooy, V-R-O-E-Y, rejected physiological conceptions of abstract labor as being a, quote, naturalistic deformation of the social reality of capitalism, end quote. If it is physiologically understood, abstract labor defines Marx's productive relationship to natural objects in general, as a generic presupposition of historically specific forms of social relations. For those Conference of Socialist Economist authors, This notion misconceived of Marx's theory of value as a refined and improved version of Ricardo's labor theory of value, which also suggested that Marx's account evolved logically from classical political economy, especially Ricardo. Yet Ricardo's labor theory of value did not distinguish between concrete and abstract labor, and Ricardo's theory treated labor as an undifferentiated category that belonged to production. His account thus, quote, lacked historical specificity. Historically specific categories are rendered universal and hence natural. It follows that any analysis which uncritically employs these categories will always tend to ascribe asocial, natural, even eternal qualities to what is socially specific to capitalism, end quote. Himmelweit and Mohan, 1978. In contrast, the Conference of Socialist Economist authors argued that the examination of value as a specific social form of wealth entailed the understanding of abstract labor as a specific capitalist form of labor. In this context, Axel Kicilloff's and Guido Starosta's stance is distinct. They argue against social form analyses of abstract labor and instead offer a vigorous defense of its physiological conception. At the same time, however, they treat value as a specifically capitalist category. They see abstract labor as a trans-historical category that in capitalism is, quote, represented, end quote, by the value form. This article examines Kicilloff's and Starosta's intriguing contention. He defines it in asocial physiological terms and insists that it is a specifically capitalist form of labor. With this in mind, the paper starts with an account of Kicilloff and Starosta's physiological reading of abstract labor and examines their critique of the contributions by De Angelis and Arthur, who, for different reasons, see abstract labor as a specifically capitalist category. These three contributions represent the spectrum of debate about abstract labor. Notwithstanding the ambivalence in Marx's own text, the paper then explores Marx's social form account of abstract labor. It argues that abstract labor is a specific temporal form of capitalist labor. The conclusion maps the political implications of these distinct conceptions. Abstract labor and its social form. For Kicilloff and Starosta, abstract labor is the material foundation of the human metabolism with nature. Man has to exchange with nature, and they characterize this exchange as the, quote, generic determination of labor, end quote. Kicilloff and Starosta. However, the circumstance that man has to exchange with nature does not say anything about the mode of production, nor is labor in the abstract possible. The reality of labor is always concrete. They therefore argue that the trans-historical nature of abstract labor expresses itself differently in distinct modes of production. Thus, in capitalism, abstract labor entails, quote, both a generic material determination and a historically specific role as the substance of value, end quote. The trans-historical materiality of abstract labor obtains through specific historical forms. They thus argue that the, quote, real, quote, genuine object of the critique of political economy is not the pure realm of social forms, but the contradictory unity between the materiality of human life and its historically determined social forms, end quote. Since abstract labor is a natural condition of human existence, and since one cannot subvert or revolutionize nature, the revolution of abstract labor has to do with its capitalist form, that is, with the way in which it is socially, quote, represented, end quote, in the form of value. Their exposition focuses on their exposition focuses only on the capitalist form of abstract labor, which provides the illustration for both its historically specific application of substantive value and its natural transhistorical materiality. Their approach then begs the question of whether it reveals abstract labor as an ontological presupposition of human existence, or whether it naturalizes capitalist economic categories. Yet despite Marx's biting critique of the, quote, economists' attempt at naturalizing economic categories, which he argues allows them to smuggle into their analyses the, quote, inviolable natural laws on which society and history in the abstract are founded, end quote, their argument is on strong textual grounds. On the one hand, Marx conceives of abstract labor as a, quote, purely social reality, end quote, that can only appear in the social relations of, quote, commodity to commodity, end quote. And on the other, he defines it physiologically as, quote, productive expenditure of human brains, nerves, and muscles, end quote. As physiological expenditure, abstract labor comprises expenditure of bodily energy in production in exchange with nature, indifferent to concrete purposes, a mere expenditure of, quote, corporeal power, end quote. Starosta, 2008. If abstract labor really is expenditure of bodily energy, then it can indeed be defined without further ado in precise physiological terms. That is, quote, muscles burn sugar, end quote. Haug, 2005. Wolfgang Fritz Haug, I think, is the Haug that's being referred to, or Wolfgang. Muscles have burned sugar since time immemorial and continue to do so, indifferent to historical development, and in this way expenditure of bodily energy appears indifferent to concrete purposes and distinct modes of production. Like Haug, Kisilov, and Starosta hold that physiological determination is the, quote, only meaningful definition of abstract labor, which, as much as its concrete aspect, is a purely material form, bearing no social or historical specificity, and yet, when performed privately and independently, and once congealed in the natural materiality of the product of labor, that purely material form acquires the form of value of the commodity, i.e., a purely social form that embodies, quote, not an atom of matter, end quote, end quote. Their critique of Rubin's form analysis is thus easily understood. Rubin did not ask how in capitalism labor, quote, in the physiological sense becomes specific in terms of value, end quote. Rubin's mistake was thus to, quote, surrender to the self-evident fact that the identity between different concrete labors contains a physiological or material determination, end quote. There is thus a need to trace the social form of abstract labor back to its natural determination, which bears no social and historical specificity. Kisilov and Starosta therefore argue that the conception of abstract labor as substance of value, quote, does not answer the question about the, quote, specific social character of the labor which produces, end quote, commodities, end quote. It merely tells us about the, quote, material determination, of which is socially recognized in the form of value, end quote. In short, quote, the analytical reduction of value to its substance, end quote, reveals only the capitalist representation of abstract labor. It does not tell us anything about its, quote, generic materiality, end quote. In their view, Marx discovered this materiality in the opening pages of Capital, which tells us that, quote, in any form of society, human beings productively expend their corporeal powers, end quote. Starosta. At the start of Capital, Marx is therefore not concerned with the, quote, common property in commodities. Rather, he is searching for, i.e., not yet unfolding, the specific determination defining the potentiality of the commodity as a historical form of social wealth, end quote. That is, Marx is said to search for the general properties of labor and is said to find these in abstract labor. The worker's labor obeys the laws of nature, and expenditure of labor is expenditure of human energy. Thus, Marx, quote, discovered abstract labor as the substance of labor in the first few pages of Capital, end quote. Starosta. This quote analytical discovery of congealed abstract labor, end quote, in the first chapter of Capital, quote, revealed the material determination of that which in capitalist society is socially represented in the form of value, end quote. In other words, before developing the capitalist categories, Marx first sought to, quote, discover, end quote, their generic material presupposition, and found this presupposition in, quote, productive labor in its general character, or abstract labor, end quote. Marx is thus said to have discovered the substance of value in something that is not specifically capitalist in character. The apparent genetic materiality of labor, its nature, its general existence as, quote, homogeneous human labor, i.e. human labor expended without regard to the form of its expenditure, end quote. Once this generic materiality was established, Marx was able to develop the commodity form. Its development entails analysis of the, quote, very social determination of the revolutionary action of the working class, end quote. Kisilov and Starosta, 2007. In distinction, both De Angelis and Arthur argue that abstract labor is a specific social form of labor that has no trans-historical validity. Massimo De Angelis emphasizes abstract labor as a form of class struggle. Like Kisilov and Starosta, he disputes Rubin's critical value theory, which argues that abstract labor is established through exchange. He holds that the abstract character of labor is, quote, a direct consequence of the character of labor in capitalism, end quote. De Angelis, 1996. Abstract labor is expended at the point of production and is, quote, imposed, end quote, on workers. Class struggle over the imposition of abstract labor has led towards an increasing homogeneity of concrete laboring by means of de-skilling and replacement of living labor by machinery. De Angelis thus conceives of abstract labor as homogenized expenditure of labor in production. He also conceives of it as an abstraction from the lived experience of workers in that it relates to subjective feelings such as boredom at work. De Angelis is rightly criticized for confusing concrete labor with abstract labor. Chris Arthur in 2001 argues similarly in his assessment of Braverman's 1974 notion of abstract labor as monotonous, repetitive, homogenized labor. Abstract labor is not concrete labor, however homogenized, monotonous, repetitive, senseless, and boring it might be. That is, boring assembly line work is boring concrete labor, not abstract labor. Kisilov and Starosta agree with De Angelis on the centrality of production as opposed to exchange and commend him for his critique of Rubin. They criticize him for failing to connect properly abstract labor to class struggle. Since De Angelis conceives of abstract labor as a result of class struggle, he is accused of ontologizing class struggle. According to Kisilov and Starosta, class struggle rests on and develops the fundamental contradiction between trans-historically conceived, quote, materiality and social form, end quote. Class struggle has thus to do with the contradictory unity between the materiality of human life and its historically specific form. As they see it, Starosta, and Kisilov, the, quote, materiality of the abstract character of human labor negates its generic role, end quote, seemingly because the, quote, material specificity of bracket capitalism, end bracket, ... consists precisely in the development of the human productive capacity to organize social labor in a fully conscious fashion, end quote. It seems as if the transhistorically conceived, or in any case naturally determined, forces of production rebel against the socially posited relations of production. Class struggle expresses the, quote, contradictory unity between materiality and social form, end quote. This formulation is reminiscent of ontological conceptions of historical materialism, according to which, as Murray put it, quote, the, quote, forces of production, end quote, are not social form determined, but on the contrary, are the ultimate determinant of, quote, relations of production, end quote, end quote. Arthur develops abstract labor in this context, in the context of debates on the, quote, new or, quote, systematic dialectic. Arthur holds that, quote, there is not only a split between form and content, but form becomes autonomous and the dialectical development of the structure is indeed form determined, end quote. Arthur thus sees the value form as expressing the abstract essence of capitalism, that is, value. Value is essence, and essence appears in the value form. Given this perspective, Arthur prefers to leave aside any discussion of labor from the opening chapters of Capital. Instead of labor, he argues that, quote, the ontological foundation of the capitalist system, end quote, is the material reality of abstraction and exchange, value. This process generates a, quote, inverted reality, end quote, in which commodities, quote, simply instantiate their abstract essence as values, end quote. The human participants in this process become the bearers of this determination of the value form. They do not know it, but they do it. Kisilov and Starosta dismiss as pure formalism Arthur's account. It, quote, overlooks the materiality of value-producing labor as a historical form of development of human productive subjectivity, end quote. In their view, Arthur's stance is indifferent to material contents and disconnects abstract labor from the material world of production, class, and struggle. His is thus a purely formal account of abstract labor. It renders material production socially and empirically insubstantial. Arthur's ontological conception of value does not interest us here. His delivery of abstract labor as a specific social form reveals important insights. In particular, his point that, quote, capitalist production posits living labor processes as abstract activity, pure motion in time, end quote, opens up a novel, temporally conceived conception of abstract labor that overcomes not only the false dichotomy between production and exchange. It also posits the materiality of abstract labor as a specifically capitalist materiality, a materiality of social labor time. Marx developed the connection between abstract labor and motion in time in his critique of 1859. Capital is not as explicit on this connection, but in my view it presupposes it. Marx quotes from his critique in Capital Volume 1, quote, as values, all commodities are only definite masses of congealed labor time, end quote. In his critique he argues, quote, on the one hand, commodities must enter the exchange process as objectified universal labor time. On the other hand, the labor time of individuals becomes objectified universal labor time only as a result of the exchange process, end quote. Quote, time is money, end quote, said Benjamin Franklin, and one might add, therefore, money is time. If, then, capitalism reduces everything to time, an abstract time, divisible into equal, homogeneous, and constant units that move on from unit to unit, dissociated from concrete human circumstances and purposes, then time really is everything. If, quote, time is everything, bracket then, end bracket, man is nothing. He is, at most, time's carcass, end quote. Marx. Marx expresses the same idea in Capital, arguing that the worker is, quote, nothing more than personified labor time, end quote. In short, Arthur's argument points towards abstract labor as a specific historical form of social time, a time made abstract. This time, as de Boer put it, quote, has no reality apart from its exchangeability, end quote. Abstract labor is the substance of value not because it has a, quote, special utility, but because it is exerted for a definite time, end quote. The substance of value is socially necessary labor time, not abstract expenditure of brains, muscles, and nerves. It is expenditure of muscle within time and measures by time. When talking about value, we are talking about the expenditure of, quote, definite masses of crystallized labor time, end quote. That is to say, quote, labor time is the living state of existence of labor. It is the living quantitative aspect of labor, as well as its inherent measure, end quote. Labor, abstract labor as social form. Social categories and nature. Ordinarily, the distinction between generic materiality and social form is discussed in terms of a separation between first nature and second nature. First nature is the so-called general metabolism with nature. Here, labor is a natural presupposition of every production process, regardless of history. Second nature comprises distinctive historical substantiations of natural necessity. The Orthodox tradition kept these two, quote, natures analytically distinct. It argued that capitalist social forms can be traced back to some natural basis, which, however, does not exist in pure natural form. It always subsists through distinct modes of production. One thus cannot find in history, quote, pure manifestations, end quote, of posited nature, or in our context, of abstract labor as, quote, a purely material form, end quote. The appearance of natural necessity is one of manifold historical overdeterminations. In distinction, social form analysis says that capitalist economic categories do not have a trans-historical validity. Capitalist economic categories belong to the society from which they spring. Capitalist laws of social reproduction are thus conceived as finite transient products of the finite and transient reality of capitalism. It rejects the notion of trans-historical laws of development and argues instead that historical materialism is the critique of things understood dogmatically. Capitalist economic categories manifest the laws of necessity of capitalistically constituted forms of social relations. From this perspective, the orthodox Marxist tradition repressed the whole problem of social constitution and instead gives historically specific social laws the status of laws of history in general, as if posited by nature. It thus conceives of capitalist social relations as developed nature. In distinction, the form analytical approach argues that social categories are socially constituted. What does this hold in relation to labor? In relation to use value producing concrete labor, its social constitution is easily understood, despite the fact that, quote, use values constitute the substance of all wealth, whatever may be the social form of that wealth, end quote. Use values are the, quote, basis of all social progress, end quote, Marx. The increase in, quote, the quantity of use values is an increase of material wealth, end quote, Marx. Nevertheless, although, quote, hunger is hunger, the hunger gratified by cooked meat eaten with a knife and a fork is a different hunger from that which bolts down raw meat with the aid of hand, nail, and tooth, end quote, Marx. For the laborer to produce commodities, he or she has to produce use values for others, quote, social use values, end quote. That is, use value is, quote, historically specific, bracket, in, end bracket, character, end quote, Marx. Lastly, concrete labor, quote, is not only the only source of material wealth, end quote. Nature produces use values too. However, the labor that is decisive in the production of capitalist wealth, value, is abstract labor. This labor is the substance of capitalist wealth. The measure of this specific social substance is socially necessary labor time. Concrete labor creates material wealth that in capitalism exists as a mere depository of exchange value. In this context, Marx's physiological definition of abstract labor contrasts sharply with his conception of abstract labor as a, quote, specific social form of labor, end quote. For Marx, the distinctiveness of capital is the double character of labor, as he put it in a letter to Engels, quote, the best points in my book are one. This is fundamental to all understanding of the facts. The double character of labor, according to whether it is expressed in use value or exchange value, which is brought out in the first chapter. 2. The treatment of surplus value independent of surplus value's particular forms of profit, interest, rent, etc. Marx. Similarly, in Capital, the fetishism of commodities, quote, has its origin in the peculiar social character of the labor that produces them, end quote. The peculiar social character of labor in capitalism comprises the existence of private labor as, quote, directly social in character, end quote. The point of departure is thus not individual production, but, quote, socially determined individual production, end quote, Marx. Concerning the fetishism of the commodity, then, quote, the fact that in the production of commodities, the specific social character of private labor carried on independently consists in the equality of every kind of labor by virtue of its being human labor, which character therefore assumes in the product the form of value, end quote. Marx. In short, quote, so far therefore as labor is a creator of use value, is useful labor, labor is a necessary condition, independent of all forms of society, for the existence of the human race. Useful labor is an eternal nature-imposed necessity, without which there can be no material exchanges between man and nature, and therefore no life, end quote, Marx. As use values, quote, the bodies of commodities are combinations of two elements, matter and labor. If we take away the useful labor expended upon them, a material substratum is always left, which is furnished by nature without any help of man. We see then that labor is not the only source of material wealth, of use values produced by labor, end quote. In contrast, quote, the value of a commodity represents human labor in the abstract, end quote, which comprises, quote, a purely social reality, end quote. Indeed, if we abstract from the useful labor expended on a product, we do not discover the so-called, quote, generic materiality, end quote, of abstract labor. What we find is matter, something for use furnished by nature. In capitalism, the concrete labor that produces use values is valid only by means of abstract labor. Against Adam Smith, Marx emphasizes that this labor is an abstraction, quote, forcibly brought about, end quote, by exchange. What Marx means here by exchange is not, quote, exchange with nature, end quote, but the exchange of commodities in capitalist society. Abstract labor is the substance of value. Value cannot be the substance of a single commodity. Value is a relationship between persons, quote, expressed as relations between things, end quote. Exchange value expresses a social relationship, and the, quote, labor which posits exchange value is a specific social form of labor, end quote, Marx. Marx thus argues that Smith and Ricardo analyzed the commodity by means of an undifferentiated notion of labor as, quote, productive activity of human beings in general, by which they mediate the material metabolism with nature, divested of every social form and determinate character, end quote. What does productive activity in general mean? In distinction to trans-historical, and in any case, ontological conceptions of natural necessity, Marx rejects the idea of production in general as a, quote, mere phantom, an abstraction that taken by itself does not exist at all, end quote. The notion that abstract labor, as the trans-historical materiality of all labor, assumes different social forms in distinct societies, transposes, therefore, quote, the truth of the law of appropriation of bourgeois society to a to a time when this society did not yet exist, end quote, Marx. Similarly, Marx argued that Ricardo failed to, quote, investigate the specific form in which labor manifests itself as the common element of commodities. Ricardo regards the, quote, bourgeois form of labor, as the eternal natural form of social labor, end quote, Marx. Concrete labor and abstract labor, on difference and equivalence. Marx praises classical political economy for its analysis of value and the magnitude of value, and classical political economy's discovery of the hidden content of forms, quote, however incompletely, end quote. Yet, Marx continues, not once did classical political economy ask why, quote, labor is represented by the value of labor's product, and labor time by the magnitude of that value, end quote. Marx. For Marx, then, labor is the material content of social forms. And he asks, quote, why does this content take that form, end quote. This passage suggests that labor has to be analyzed as the, quote, content of that form, end quote. Furthermore, he suggests that political economy, especially Ricardo, nowhere, quote, expressly and with full consciousness distinguishes between labor, as labor appears in the value of a product, and the same labor, as that labor appears in the use value of that product. Of course, this distinction is practically made, but he has not the but he has not the least idea that when the difference between various kinds of labor is treated as purely quantitative, their qualitative unity or equality, and therefore their reduction to abstract labor, is implied, end quote. Marx does not differentiate between a general, quote, labor that is represented by value, end quote, and a general labor that is the material content of social forms. There is only one social labor, and this labor doubles into concrete labor and abstract labor. As use values, qualitatively distinct products are the natural form of concrete labor. At the same time, they are qualitatively distinct commodities because, quote, human labor is accumulated in bracket them, end bracket, end quote. It is this, quote, equivalence between different sorts of commodities that alone brings into relief the specific character of value-creating labor, end quote. Marx. Abstract labor comprises relations of equivalence. Abstract labor is not some substance that hides in individual commodities. Abstract labor is a, quote, social substance, end quote, which can be expressed only by means of exchange in relation of one commodity to another. This exchange is, quote, evidently an act characterized by a total abstraction from use value, end quote. Exchange cannot take place without equality, and equality not without commensurability. Equality, too, becomes abstract in that equality is indifferent to quality, distinction, specificity, purpose, and indeed judgment and reason. Quote, there is no difference or distinction in things of equal value. 100 pounds worth of lead or iron is of as great a value as 100 pounds worth of silver or gold, end quote. This equality is the equality of labor in the abstract, of a homogeneous labor that can be divided into equal units, each, quote, the same as any other, end quote. This objective existence of equality as abstract equivalence is, quote, a purely social reality, end quote. It comprises a substance that, although common to all commodities, quote, cannot be either a geometrical, a chemical, or any other natural property of commodities. Such properties claim our attention only insofar as those natural properties affect the utility of those commodities, make those commodities use values, end quote. What the commodities have in common, therefore, is human labor in the abstract, and this labor comprises a purely social reality. No chemist, quote, has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or a diamond. The economic discoverers of this chemical element, who, by the by, lay special claim to critical acumen, find, however, that the use value of objects belongs to those objects independently of their material properties, while their value, on the other hand, forms a part of them as objects. What confirms them in this view is the peculiar circumstance that the use value of objects is realized without exchange, by means of a direct relation between the objects and man, while on the other hand their value is realized only by exchange, that is, by means of a social process, end quote. Marx. For example, Smith, quote, mistakes the objective equalization of unequal labors forcibly brought about by the social process of the subjective equality of the labors of individuals, end quote. As values, commodities are all the same as, quote, crystals of this social substance, end quote. That is, quote, mere congelation of homogeneous human labor, end quote. As values, commodities consist thus of the, quote, same unsubstantial reality, end quote. Values' unsubstantial reality has to do with the double character of labor. The real existence of labor is always concrete. Every physiological expenditure of labor is expenditure of concrete labor. That is, physiological expenditure of labor entails a specific productive application and is thus concrete. The, quote, productive power has reference, of course, only to labor of some useful concrete form. The efficacy of any special productive activity during a given time being dependent on its productiveness. ... Productive power is an attribute of the concrete useful forms of labor. End quote. Marx. Muscles do not burn sugar in the abstract. Labor is concrete labor, not labor in the abstract. What then is specific about capitalism, if not abstract labor as such, but the circumstance that concrete labor has to take the form of concrete labor's opposite, undifferentiated human labor, to count as socially necessary labor? The, quote, labor which creates exchange value is thus abstract general labor, end quote. And, quote, as exchange values, all commodities are merely definite quantities of congealed labor time, end quote. This, quote, reduction of exchange value to labor time, end quote, entails abstract labor as a, quote, specific social form of labor, end quote. Abstract labor is not a substance that one can touch, see, smell, or eat. As use values, commodities do not contain exchange value. As exchange values, they do not contain an atom of use values. Excuse me. Let me reread that. As exchange values, they do not, quote, contain an atom of use value, end quote. Their natural form is their concrete existence is use values. Quote, commodities come into the world in the shape of use values, articles, or goods. This is their plain, homely, bodily form, end quote. Marx. Commodities are commodities, quote, only insofar as they have two forms, a physical or natural form and a value form, end quote. Finally, quote, the value of commodities is the very opposite of the coarse materiality of commodities' substance. Not an atom of matter enters into the commodity's composition, end quote. On the other hand, commodities acquire a purely social reality insofar as commodities are expressions, quote, of one identical social substance, viz. Human labor, ... It follows as a matter of course that value can only manifest value's self in the social relation of commodity to commodity, end quote. That is to say, no single commodity, quote, has value objectivity for itself, but each commodity has value objectivity insofar as it is a common objectivity. Outside the relation to each other, outside the relation in which they count as equal, neither coat nor linen possess value objectivity as congealed human labor as such, end quote. Marx. Marx has great trouble in expressing value objectivity as a social relationship between things. Value objectivity's reality is both sensuous and supersensible, a real abstraction, and he not only speaks of a, quote, phantom-like objectivity, end quote, or, quote, purely fantastic objectivity, end quote, but also says that value is, quote, invisible in commodities, or as Bellafiore put it, strictly speaking, value is, quote, a ghost, end quote. Sorry. See the pause for a second. I think I'm dehydrated. I think I need to swig some Wawa. Where am I? Ghost and Vampire. On time. What does it mean to say value is invisible, like a ghost? What expenditure of abstract labor are we dealing with? This section argues that abstract labor is a real abstraction. Abstract labor projects the, quote, ghost of value, end quote, that achieves validity in the form of money back into production, where the ghost turns into a vampire that sucks living labor dry, reducing living labor to, quote, time's carcass, end quote. Actual labor is always labor, quote, in motion, end quote. That is, quote, actually expended, end quote. Marx. Quote, just as motion is measured by time, so is labor by labor time. Bracket it, end bracket, is the living quantitative reality of labor, end quote. This is the time of abstract, constant, and equal time units, measured by clock time. Quote, direct labor time, bracket, is the, end bracket, decisive factor of wealth, end quote. Marx. Each commodity, quote, objectifies general social labor time. A specific quantity of general labor time is expressed in its exchange value in a series in indeterminate quantities of different use values. And conversely, the exchange value of all other commodities measure the use value of this exclusive commodity, end quote. Marx. Clock time is dissociated from the actual human affairs that clock time measures in homogeneous, equal, divisible, constant temporal units. Yet, however dissociated, it appears as the substance of the very same activity that it measures. Thus, quote, time appears simultaneously as a measure of value and as value substance, end quote. Daniel Ben Said. From the tick to the tock, clock time measures human activity regardless of specific contents. In clock time, the expenditure of labor does not occur in its own good time. The expenditure of labor occurs within time, a time made abstract and imposing. Conventionally, this conception of time is defined as linear time, where time exists as an independent framework for motion, events, and activities, and that devoid of content moves forward relentlessly, quote, into time, end quote. Time measures activities, but is dissociated from activities. Quote, homogeneous time is empty time, end quote. Homogeneous time measures what homogeneous time is not. Homogeneous time measures concrete expenditure, whatever that concrete expenditure's content. Ben Said. It is also a reified time in that it appears timeless, without beginning or end, immanent to itself, purely abstract. As timeless time, it is nothing, yet it appears as a being whose passing ticks and tocks human activity. Labor time, which is always concrete as an activity in time, appears as labor time's opposite, as infinite time that is founded on itself and passes by itself. It is not man who meets her needs in time. Rather, time subsumes man, as if by fate or natural necessity, and organizes her labor according to an economy of time that never stands still. Time is restless, in constant motion, encompassing no playfulness and lacking in a federated present. From the tick to the tock, time measures the duration of labor time, quote, in hours, end quote. Marx. The reduction of use values to depositories of objectified social labor time is, quote, an abstraction that is made on a daily basis in every social production process. The dissolution of all commodities into labor time is no greater an abstraction, but no less real than that of all organic bodies into air, end quote. Marx. This dissolution is the condition of the social existence of material wealth in capitalism. That is, quote, with reference to use value, the labor contained in a commodity counts only qualitatively. With reference to value, it accounts only quantitatively, and must first be reduced to human labor pure and simple. In the former case, it is a question of how and what. In the latter, of how much and how long a time, end quote. Marx. Concrete labor takes place in time and has a concrete temporality. In order for this labor to count as social labor, it has to manifest itself as valid value in exchange. That is, its concrete labor time has to occur within homogeneous, in quote, homogeneous time, end quote. Concrete labor time's measure is socially necessary labor time. Concrete labor time is compelled to occur within the time of concrete labor time's abstract measure. If it does not, that concrete labor time is nothing, valueless. In sum, the labor spent on commodities, quote, counts effectively only insofar as the labor spent on commodities is spent in a form that is useful to others. Whether that labor is useful for others and its product consequently capable of satisfying the wants of others can be proved only by the act of exchange, end quote. Marx. Expenditure of labor is expenditure of concrete labor within a certain time frame. In order to be valid and to count as such concrete labor, it has to be objectified as abstract labor in exchange. Thus, the real value of a commodity is its, quote, social value. That is to say, the real value is not measured by the labor time that the article in each individual case costs the producer, but by the labor time socially required for its production, end quote. The magnitude of value is measured by, quote, the quantity of the value-forming substance, the labor which it contains. This quantity is measured by its duration, and labor time is itself measured on the particular scale of hours, days, etc., end quote. Marx. The measure of value is socially necessary labor time. Marx's familiar definition, quote, socially necessary labor time is the labor time required to produce any use value under the prevailing socially normal conditions of production, and with the prevalent socially average degree of skill and intensity of labor, end quote, expresses the social character of individual labor. Quote, only because the labor time of the spinner and the labor time of the weaver represent universal labor time, and their products are thus universal equivalents, is the social aspect of the labor of the two individuals represented for each of them by the labor of the other, end quote. In this sense, the individual characteristics of the laborer are obliterated. As Marx put it in his critique, quote, labor, which is thus measured by time, does not seem, indeed, to be the labor of different subjects, but on the contrary, the different working individuals seem to be mere organs of this labor, bracket, of human labor in general, end quote. Different labors appear thus as different expenditures of the same social labor time. Objectified social labor time is the objectified labor of a working individual, a, quote, individual indistinguishable from all other individuals, end quote. Quote, the total labor power of society, which is embodied in the sum total of the values of all commodities produced by that society, counts here as one homogeneous mass of labor power composed, though it be, of innumerable individual units, end quote. Insofar as all individual labor units are mere organs of social labor time, quote, each of these units is the same as any other, insofar as it has the character of the average labor power of society, no more time than is needed on an average, no more than is socially necessary, end quote. Labor time is objectified only once, in the use values of commodities. This labor time, quote, is both the substance that turns them into exchange values, and, therefore, into commodities, and the standard by which the precise magnitude of their value is measured, end quote. Marx. The circuits, money, commodity, money plus an increment, and money, production, money prime, encompasses the reality of labor time. The elementary form, money, ... money prime, encompasses it too, as a mortgage on the future appropriation, that is, theft of surplus labor time, or as presently fictitious wealth. Labor time, as the measure of the magnitude of value, is not fixed and given. The, quote, labor time that yesterday was without doubt socially necessary for the production of a yard of linen ceases to be so today, end quote. Marx. That is to say, whether the concrete expenditure of time is rendered valid as socially necessary labor time can only be established post festum. The expenditure of concrete labor is thus done, quote, in the hope, rather than the assurance, that the labor they perform will turn out to be socially required, end quote. Smith. Our capitalists, this personification of, quote, value in process, money in process, and as such capital, end quote, is thus spurred into action, frantically seeking to make the expenditure of concrete labor time under his command counts socially as expenditure of necessary social labor time. There he expropriates unpaid social labor time. Here he seeks to make his fortune as a seller of objectified social labor time. Labor time as the measure of wealth is also the substance of wealth. That is to say, time as measure of its own substance, quote, must itself be measured, end quote. In the form of profit, the rate of return on expropriated unpaid labor time. Ben Said, 2002. For the laborer, the consequences are formidable. That is, the, quote, time occupied in the labor of production must not exceed the time really necessary under the given social conditions of the case, end quote. How much labor time went into it? How long a time did it take? Time is money. No time to waste. More time to catch. This then is the, quote, nibbling and cribbling at meal times, end quote, as, quote, moments of the elements of profit, end quote. Marx. Pace de Angelis. Abstract labor is imposed. Work has to be performed not in its own good time, but within time. Work that is not completed within time is wasted, valueless, regardless of the usefulness of the material wealth that it has created and the needs that it could satisfy. From the appropriation of unpaid labor time to the endless struggle over the division between necessary labor time and surplus labor time, from the, quote, imposition of labor time by time theft, this, quote, petty pilferings of minutes, end quote, snatching a few minutes, end quote, Marx, to the stealing from the worker of atoms of additional unpaid labor time by means of great labor flexibility. The lifetime of the worker is reduced to labor time. The worker then appears as, quote, nothing more than personified labor time, end quote, as, quote, time's carcass, end quote. That is to say, capitalist wealth is based on, quote, the theft of alien time, end quote. Marx. Conclusion. Marx's account of abstract labor is ambivalent. On the one hand, he defines abstract labor in physiological terms, arguing that value is the crystallization and congelation of the expenditure of human muscles, etc. On the other, Marx treats abstract labor as a specifically capitalist form of labor, arguing that commodities are such crystallizations only because they objectify socially necessary labor time. Kisilov and Starosta explicate the first aspect with great clarity and against form analytical approaches that stress the veracity of the latter. Purport this second aspect to be a capitalist objectification of the former. They think that the physiological definition is the only meaningful definition and characterize the physiological definition as, quote, a purely material form bearing no historical specificity, end quote. I have argued instead that abstract labor is a specific capitalist form of labor. The materiality of abstract labor is socially constituted. A materiality of labor conceived in abstraction from capitalist social relations is one of those, quote, theological quirks, end quote, that give commodities their, quote, mystical character, end quote. Kisilov and Starosta say that the representation of abstract labor in capitalism is a fetish form of social relations. Yet by defining abstract labor as a purely material form that bears no social or historical specificity, Kisilov and Starosta themselves fetishize abstract labor. That is, Kisilov and Starosta identify abstract labor as an enduring, ahistorical, generative mechanism that underlies distinct modes of production, and Kisilov and Starosta therefore challenged the capitalist modality of abstract labor in terms of its class-specific social appearance. It seems that in capitalism, abstract labor is the curse of the dependent masses, whilst in its socialist modality, abstract labor might well be equally accomplished. Physiologically defined labor does indeed appear as the ontological foundation of all existence. Exchange value is the determination of the commodity, and seems to belong to the commodity as if by nature. This, quote, nature is, however, socially specific. This, quote, nature is a capitalist nature. This historically specific necessity does appear objective, trans-historical, and natural. Pastone, 1996, and Reichelt, 2008, argue that Marx's physiological definition of abstract labor is the first step towards his subsequent explication of the fetishism of commodities. They thus deny that Marx's account is ambivalent. Its veracity might be hidden and needs to be deciphered by means of critical reconstruction. See Reichelt, 1995. Heinrich, in 1999 and 2009, in contrast, accepts that Marx's account is ambivalent. Heinrich argues that Marx's revolutionary break with classical political economy is marked by the pains of transition, leaving a multi-layered argument so that in our case, the social determination of abstract labor overlaps with naturalistic definitions. Instead of critical reconstruction, Heinrich argues for the further development of the revolutionary aspects of the critique of political economy. I have argued that the physiological definition of abstract labor presumes that a biological condition, muscles burn sugar, is the ontological foundation of social existence. Such an account naturalizes economic categories, quote, as if the bracket, imagined, end bracket, individual, and isolated hunter and fisherman, with whom Smith and Ricardo begin, end quote, were an actual fact, posited by nature, not arising historically in the midst of bourgeois development. History, not nature, is the point of critical departure. In distinction to the orthodox differentiation between the naturally conceived generative mechanisms of the forces of production and their historically specific modality in the determinate social relations of production, the forces of production and social relations of production are, quote, two different sides of the development of the social individual, end quote. In capitalism, Marx argued, every social progress turns into a calamity. Every increase in labor productivity shortens the hours of labor, but in the increase in labor productivity's capitalist form, the increase in labor productivity lengthens the hours of labor. The introduction of sophisticated machinery lightens labor, but in the introduction of sophisticated machinery's capitalist form, the introduction of sophisticated machinery heightens the intensity of labor. Every increase in the productivity of labor increases the material wealth of the producers, but in its capitalist form, makes them paupers. Most importantly of all, greater labor productivity sets labor free, makes labor redundant. But rather than shortening the hours of work and thus absorbing available labor into production on the basis of a shorter working day, liberating lifetime from the, quote, realm of necessity, end quote, for the, quote, realm of freedom, end quote, those in employment are exploited more intensively, while those made redundant find themselves on the scrap heap of a mode of production that sacrifices, quote, human machines on the pyramid of accumulation, end quote. Gambino. Capital is thus, quote, the moving contradiction, bracket in, end bracket, that capital presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while capital posits labor time on the other side as sole measure and source of wealth, end quote. Marx. Two issues follow. The trans-historical treatment of abstract labor turns upside down the critical insight that the double character of labor is specific to capitalism. Trans-historically conceived abstract labor becomes the ontological foundation of all social life. In this roundabout way, concrete labor would figure as a specifically capitalist form of labor. Rejecting this absurd notion would mean that concrete labor, too, be treated as a condition independent of all forms of society. The double character of labor would thus cease to be capitalism's determining characteristic and, akin to Ricardo's undifferentiated category of labor, all labor processes would in fact be similar in all societies. The differences in the mode of production would thus be reduced to distinctions in the social organization of undifferentiated labor, say from the capitalist organization of abstract labor to its socialist organization, or from the capitalist implementation of Taylorism to the Soviet implementation of Taylorism. When posited as natural, abstract labor appears as a force of nature, legitimizing existing social relations as developed nature, and delineating possible futures as idealized derivatives of the existent. Both depend on the deadly notion that, quote, freedom is recognition of necessity, end quote, Engels. Yet nature has nothing to do with it. Distinct conceptions of abstract labor entail different political implications. For the orthodox tradition, abstract labor accounted for the magnitude of value, and labor was thus seen as an economic resource that a socialist state would plan and allocate ostensibly on behalf of workers. Rubin's turn toward a critical theory of value argued against value's trans-historical naturalization in favor of value's determination as a specifically capitalist form of labor. Politically, this turn rejected socialism as a well-ordered republic of labor. Despite their attempt to expunge orthodox political consequences from their argument, Kisilov and Starosta's trans-historical treatment of abstract labor does not lend itself easily to alternative political outcomes. Their understanding of, quote, capitalism as a transition to communism, end quote, Kisilov and Starosta, citing Chattopadhyay, remains mired in the illusionary certainty of trans-historical laws of development, which on closer inspection seems in every respect to be tied to capitalist realities, from the enduring centrality of material labor to the philosophy of history. It is not the existing social formation, it's not the existing historical form of abstract labor that needs to be abolished in favor of its socialist substantiation. I am not convinced that abstract labor in the physiological sense as productive expenditure of brains, muscles, nerves, and hands is the material substance of communist wealth. What needs to be abolished is abstract labor. This, then, is the idea of communism in which the substance and measure of wealth is disposable time beyond that used in immediate production. Time freed from the realm of necessity is the very content of life. This time of freely associated producers who organize the realm of necessity through the realm of freedom is different from a conception of time that holds that time is money. Discussion of the time of capital and the time of the commune falls outside the scope of this essay, but see Benjamin, de Boer, and Marcuse, and Tischler, who argue that human emancipation is the practical negation of a time made abstract, and one has to add the creation of relations in which concrete labor is directly social.